Let's move on and talk about aggregate expenditure. To calculate planned expenditure at any given real GDP, the expenditure components that we talked about earlier must be added together. So we have planned consumption, planned investment, planned government spending, and planned exports minus imports. You add those together and you can calculate planned expenditure at a given level of real GDP. The aggregate expenditure curve is plotted comparing planned expenditure in the y-axis with real GDP on the x-axis. Let's take a look at how we actually form this curve. So first we're going to take investment. And investment is assumed to be constant, so we have a straight line. And then we're going to add on to that government spending, which again, in this case, we're assuming is constant. It's not changing with real GDP. On top of that, we're going to add on exports. And again, we're assuming that that is not changing with real GDP. So we have investment plus government spending plus exports. And that is all assumed to be constant. And then we're going to add on consumption. And all we've done here is we've added the consumption function to the level of, investment plus government spending plus exports. So that sloped line that you see there is the consumption function added on to I plus G plus X. And so that gives us C plus I plus G plus X. And so we know that we also have imports whenever we're in an open market. So we're going to take away the import function. But don't worry about what the import function is for now. All you need to know is that the import function is just like a consumption function. It's sloped upwards because as real GDP increases, we tend to import more. And all you've done is you've subtracted every point of that import function from the C plus I plus G plus X. And that, in essence, gives you the aggregate expenditure curve. Induced expenditure is consumption expenditure minus imports. And autonomous expenditure is investment plus government spending plus export. And that makes sense because, as we've described earlier, autonomous expenditure is when consumption expenditure is equal to zero. So people are not buying stuff. If they're not buying anything, then they're not buying imports either. So we don't need to worry about that. So in essence, if anyone ever asks you, if your prof ever or your teacher asks you to calculate autonomous expenditure, it's going to be equal to I plus G plus X, investment plus government expenditure plus exports. This is the level of expenditure that would be planned if real GDP were equal to zero. Consumption and imports also have an autonomous component, but it does not vary with real GDP. The aggregate expenditure curve summarizes the relationship between aggregate planned expenditure and real GDP. Actual aggregate expenditure always equals real GDP, but planned aggregate expenditure is not always equal to real GDP. And this happens because firms end up with inventories that are greater or smaller than planned. And we're going to see how this works in the next slide. When we talk about equilibrium, we want to find the point at which real GDP is equal to aggregate expenditure. And so we're going to enlist the help of the 45-degree line once again. And the 45-degree line again has a slope of 1. So it's going to be telling us where aggregate planned expenditure is equal to real GDP on all points. So we want to look for the point at which aggregate expenditure intersects the 45-degree line because that's going to be the point on the aggregate expenditure curve where aggregate planned expenditure equals real GDP. And so in essence, equilibrium expenditure is the level of aggregate expenditure that occurs when aggregate expenditure or planned aggregate expenditure equals real GDP. This is the point at which spending plans are fulfilled. If we're below the equilibrium level, then firms, in this whole model, we're going to assume that firms have inventory targets based on sales. And if we're below equilibrium, then inventories fall below target. So firms increase production to restore target levels. To increase production, firms hire extra labor. And so if inventories still fall below target, then firms have to hire even more labor to increase production even more. And this continues until equilibrium is reached. If firms increase production, then real GDP increases, and so does aggregate planned expenditure because the firms have planned to increase production. So that keeps happening until equilibrium is reached. But if we're at a point above the equilibrium, so planned expenditure is below real GDP, then firms' inventories rise by that difference created between the real and planned expenditure. So production will decrease until equilibrium is reached. And if production decreases, then obviously we have a decrease in real GDP. But because firms have already planned this, then their aggregate planned expenditure for the entire economy decreases as well, and so that keeps happening until we reach the point of equilibrium.